On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to take a look at the Ancient Book of Enoch, part 2 of our series. And in this particular section of the Book of Enoch, he takes a trip aboard a strange celestial craft, which he calls a house. It's a smaller house, and it takes him up somewhere to a larger house. And Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me this fascinating description of Enoch's walking among the angels.
J.R., it's fascinating to look at the Bible when it talks about Enoch walking with God, and when it talks about the fallen angels coming down and cohabiting with human women. You get very, very little detail. The book of Enoch acts as a kind of a magnifying glass, giving us a great deal of detail. Now, again, the book of Enoch is not a canonized work and should not be treated as divine holy scripture. Nevertheless, Jewish tradition, literally thousands of years of history validate the words of this book, part of which is even quoted in the New Testament. And therefore, we look at it as a way of seeing in detail what we can only glimpse in a very broad brush way in the book of Genesis.
To begin with, in the book of Genesis chapter 5, verse 24, the Bible says, "And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." And the book of Hebrews tells us in the New Testament that Enoch was translated. He walked with God. That is not a metaphor for holy living. He literally walked in heaven. He was taken aboard the celestial vehicles of the angels. He lived for a while in the presence of the angels. There were 7 archangels, which we'll get into in our next installment on this book. Among them, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, and others. And he literally walked among these angels. And he went to, as we shall see in today's program, he went to a place where the throne of God was. And he saw God, and God talked to him. So when it says he walked with God, that's literal in the book of Genesis. Gary, this is an incredible study here.
It is. And as we look at the third section of the book of Enoch, chapters 12 through 16, J.R., it's well to look closely at the major theme presented by the book of Enoch. It magnifies and expands the idea the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men. And it expands them in this way by telling us what those angels were doing and the ways in which they contaminated the human race. And whereas Genesis hints at this, the book of Enoch just comes right out and gives great detail about this contamination process.
Yes, it does. And by the way, these books, like the book of Enoch, the book of Jubilees, from the very nature of these books, they set many of the themes in eschatology, the apocalyptic rendition of theology, shall we say. Well, let's begin with chapter 12. And we are told here, and previous to all these things, Enoch was hidden. And not one of the children of men knew where he was hidden and where he was or what had become of him. And all his deeds were with the holy ones and with the watchers in his days. In other words, Enoch walked among angels. And he was hidden. And it says here, previous to all these things. So what we've seen in the first 11 chapters gives us an introduction to this theme. But prior to his going to Azazel and the 200 fallen angels and delivering to them the judgment of God, he, previous to these things, was taken into the presence of God and given the message with which he condemned these fallen angels. And one of the interesting things about it here in verse 4, the angels call out to him and say, "Enoch, thou scribe of justice, go and announce to the watchers of heaven who have left the high heaven and the holy eternal place and have contaminated themselves with women." Gary, here Enoch is called the scribe of justice. Now, this means as a scribe, he knew letters. He was the first to teach men how to write and read. So we go to the book of Jubilees, and we find that Enoch was called the first person to teach men to read and write in a language that became known as the Hebrew language. So Hebrew was the first language. It was the language of heaven.
Actually, it predated the idea of Hebrew, which originated with Abraham much, much later. That language
Yes.
was already in existence as God's language. And you know, the sages of Israel say that the 22 letters were used by God to speak the universe into existence. And I have no reason to think that that's a confabulation. I really believe that those 22 letters are from God.
So it may not have been known as the Hebrew language originally, but it is the same language that today is known as the Hebrew language. And it's interesting that the book of Jubilees should bear this out. For centuries, only fragments of the book of Jubilees existed. It is said that were it not for the Oriental Orthodox churches, the book of Jubilees might not have survived at all. But 4 complete books of Jubilees in Ethiopic translations existed or surfaced in the 15th and 16th centuries. Also, between 1947 and 1956, 15 Hebrew scroll fragments of the book of Jubilees were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So today, the book of Jubilees does exist, almost extinct.
Wow.
And it came to life again.
Isn't it interesting, J.R., that the book of Jubilees and the book of Enoch dropped out of sight for a while until it was time for them to pop back up again,
Yes.
just so that we could use them.
So that we would know how to configure the last days. In fact, according to what I have read, the book of Jubilees is also known as the book of divisions. It is a view of the history, quote, the history of the divisions of the days of the law, of the events of the years and year weeks, that is the sabbatical years, and the jubilees of the world as secretly revealed to Moses by angels during his 40-day stay atop Mount Sinai. And the Oriental Orthodox churches held that the book was first written in heaven before the beginning of time and kept in the possession of angels prior to its being given to Moses, thus predating the writing of the book of Genesis. And the rabbis thought that it was a part of Jewish apocalypticism. Now, the book of Jubilees predicts a messianic kingdom, teaches that the Messiah will arise from the tribe of Judah and will reign for 1,000 years. Now, Gary, that's premillennialism.
Absolutely. In fact, it amazes me to read the book of Enoch. It talks about the tribulation. It opens with the tribulation. And it says that tribulation is going to be at the very end of days. In other words, it's still in our future.
Yes. So, we begin with the watchman. You notice he says that Enoch lived among the watchers. The watchers were the angels.
Yeah. You know, J.R., I thought a watcher. When you say that word, I'm reminded of John's trip to the throne of God, and he saw living creatures at God's throne, and they were full of eyes.
Yes.
And they were called the watchers. Actually, in some cases called cherubs. Sometimes, as Satan used to be known as the anointed cherub that covered. In other words, their job seems to be to observe and to guard and to act as guardians and protectors for the throne of God.
Indeed. So from that came the idea of guardian angels. The watchers in Daniel 4:13 tells us that they were angels. This is what it says. Behold, a watcher and an holy one came down from heaven. He cried aloud and said thus, hew down the tree. So this is the story of Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a great tree, and one of the watchers of heaven came down. So they were commonly known, even in Daniel's day, as the watchers.
The watchers. Now, for Enoch to have been in that close communication with these watchers, J.R., means that he occupied a very special position. Genesis says, and Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah. That's Genesis 5:22. And we say, oh, walking with God, walking with God. Well, is that some kind of a metaphor? Or did he actually walk with God? And in what way did he walk with God?
Which brings us, of course, to chapter 13 and his message to Azazel and to Shemjaze. And when he gave this message, that they will have no peace, but great condemnation had come upon them. They were all afraid, verse 3 says. Fear and trembling seized them, and they begged Enoch to write a memorial petition for them and carry it to God, begging for forgiveness. But there was to be no forgiveness to these angels.
That means that Enoch had a very, very extraordinary position in human history. To act as, if you will, God's ambassador to humanity, given the privilege of writing something that would be passed down to the ages, as acting as a go-between in the world of the angels. Enoch is perhaps much, much higher in status than we ever imagined before.
Yes, a lot of clout.
A lot of clout.
Even the fallen angels respected Enoch. And to me, I'd be afraid to walk among angels, especially fallen angels.
Indeed.
You know, I would fear for my safety. But evidently, they appreciated Enoch for he was the seventh generation from Adam. So he walked in the court of Seth, the son of Adam, who was king of the world at that time.
You know, this all, again, I don't think we can repeat this too often. The core of what's going on here is that these fallen angels have contaminated both themselves and the planet Earth by commingling angelic, if you will, DNA with human DNA. The Bible theme says it's the seed of the serpent versus the seed of the woman. And this is why Enoch is called the scribe of justice. He is given the ability to write this down, to chronicle it, to detail it, so that one day, in fact, right now, we can look at it and see what happened.
So in the book of Enoch, chapter 13 and verse 7, Enoch says, and going, that is, he left Azazel, and they were all on top of Mount Hermon, by the way. He had gone up to Mount Hermon and pronounced God's condemnation upon these fallen angels. And then he says, leaving that area, I sat down near the waters of Dan in Dan, which is to the right or the south of the evening side or the west of Hermon, and read their memorial petition until I fell asleep, and behold, a dream came to me. Now, Gary, he describes the headwaters of the Jordan River. He said, I sat down by the waters of Dan in Dan. Now, I do not know if Enoch actually wrote these words down here, because there was no tribe of Dan in Enoch's day. But I can tell you this, we are given these words, Dan in Dan, to help us to know exactly the location of Mount Hermon and this outcropping of water on the southwest side of the Lebanon mountain range that fed the headwaters of the Jordan River.
J.R., it's so amazing to read this, because the Hebrew word for judgment is deen. One of the, that's the root word. One of the cognates of that word is Dan, the tribe of Dan. And Dan was prophesied to be a judge. That was the prophecy that was made over him. And if we really look at this carefully, where Enoch says, and going, I sat down near the waters of Dan in Dan, it invokes a theme of judgment. Waters of Dan, which root word means judgment, in Dan, which is judgment, and the Jordan River, if you will, which in your article you write means the going down of the Dan.
Yes.
All of that speaks of themes of judgment, and it's interesting that Enoch is called the scribe of justice or judgment.
Yes. So we have Dan mentioned here in the book of Enoch. There's a reason, I think, why Dan is marked out here. And that reason is Dan was going to cohabit with these the members of the tribe of Dan. We're going to cohabit with these fallen angels, and mixed into the DNA structure of the offspring of the tribe of Dan would be the seed of the serpent. In other words, the tribe of Dan would be the tribe that would one day bring forth the Antichrist.
Well, as we conclude the idea that Dan means judgment and that Enoch is the scribe of judgment, Dan shall judge his people. That's what Jacob said of his son, Dan. And you know, Dan went up and lived in those waters and then migrated off into Greece. And that's another story. But the story is of sin and judgment. It is the story of the seed of the serpent versus the seed of the woman. Dan is said to be a serpent by the way. There's a theme we could spend a whole hour on. And that brings us now to section 4, chapters 17 through 21 of the book of Enoch. And J.R., here we go to the flying house, which I am particularly interested in.
Yes. So, in chapter 14 and verse 8, Enoch writes, "And the vision appeared unto me thus. Behold, clouds in the vision invited me, and a fog invited me, and the course of the stars and lightnings drove and pressed me, and the winds in the vision gave me wings and drove me, and they lifted me up into heaven. And I went till I approached near a wall which was built of crystals, and a tongue of fire surrounding it." Verse 10 says, "I went into the tongue of fire and approached near to a large house which was built of crystals. And the walls of this house were like a floor inlaid with crystals, and the groundwork was of crystals, and the ceiling was like the course of the stars of the lightning, and the cherubim of fire between them, and their heaven was water, and a flaming fire surrounded the walls, and its doors burned with fire." He said it was hot like fire and cold like ice, and nothing pleasant about it.
Yeah.
This is a fascinating view.
And quickly, I misspoke because I said chapter 17. I meant to say chapter 14 in the book of Enoch. And so we are in this celestial vehicle. Now, let me say something really quickly, J.R. What impresses me about this discourse is that I'm a pilot. I've been a pilot for over 50 years, flying continuously until this very day. And I know what it looks like to fly in an airplane. In other words, you have a certain perspective. If you've never been up in an airplane before and somebody takes you up and starts to point out the features, you can quickly get lost because it requires a different way of looking at terrain. And after you fly a while, you get used to seeing that terrain, and you no longer get lost because your eyes accustom themselves to that view. Well, J.R., this couldn't have been written by somebody who had never been up in a machine, because the view is exactly what you see when you look out of a machine that's flying up above the earth.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It is.
And on our next program, that is next month, when we get to discussing Enoch's trip back from heaven down to the earth, he's taken on a tour of the planet, and we'll see that absolutely incredibly. Notice, please, the clouds and the fog that drove him and lifted him up. It's kind of like beam me up, Scotty type of teleporting machine. You know?
It is. Very much so. He describes what we would call technology today in the language of a man who never has been exposed to technology in his life. And he describes feelings, sights. J.R., it's fascinating that this fog and this cloud almost becomes associated with moving from one place to another.
Flavius Josephus also mentions a cloud that transported Moses. He wrote, quote, "As he, Moses, was going to embrace Eleazar and Joshua and was still discoursing with them, a cloud stood over him on a sudden, and he disappeared." This is in the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 4, Chapter 8, Paragraph 48. And other clouds, fog, smoke, or whirlwinds are described as attending the descent of God to Mount Sinai in Exodus 19, verse 16. The translation of Elijah in 2 Kings 2:11. Isaiah's vision of God's throne in Isaiah 6:4. Ezekiel's view of God's transportation vehicle in Ezekiel 1:4. Daniel's vision of the coming of the Son of Man in Daniel 7:13, and the ascension of Christ in Acts 1:9. All of these describe a cloud, a fog, a whirlwind, a mighty wind. Just as Ezekiel says, the cloud beckoned me, and the fog beckoned me, and the wind drove me.
And dare I say, the rapture of the church seems to be accompanied by the clouds of heaven.
Yes. And we don't know what these clouds are, but they apparently are some kind of a house. So he begins to describe this thing. He says its walls consisted of inlaid crystal-like surface with tongues of fire surrounding it. Now, I think Ezekiel could have been describing a hard composite glass-like substance, not necessarily a clear, transparent wall. And the tongues of fire remind me of high-voltage generators used in anti-gravity lifters. And if you'd like to read about that or see a video on anti-gravity lifters, go to google.com and search for lifter technology and watch the videos. It's fascinating, Gary, that 50,000 volts run along a little wire suspended about 3 inches above a balsa wood frame of triangles can actually lift that thing up off of the surface of the floor or table. Lifter technology, high voltage.
And that's only man's crude attempt at the current time. Can you imagine what God does with his level of technology? And JR, this reminds me too, you're talking about the substance of the walls. It reminds me of what John saw in heaven when he described transparent gold.
Yes.
We don't have transparent gold, but apparently that's some kind of building material.
And then Enoch said, the ceiling was like the course of the stars and of the lightning, and the cherubim of fire were between them, and their heaven was water. Well, I can imagine Enoch, and forgive me for my human way of trying to describe what he saw, but this is my best shot at it, okay? I've written, I imagine Enoch describing a series of video monitors whose screens appear transparent as heaven or the sky, whose surface seemed reflective, similar to the surface of water or glass. These could be used for navigating through the universe, that is the course of the stars, and the cherubim could be the navigators, angels sitting at consoles piloting the vehicle. It just seems, you know, that this is what he was trying to describe.
And it's not too far out for me, because after all, Ezekiel experienced something like that, in which the cherubim piloted the chariot that brought the Son of Man right to the place where Ezekiel was standing. So this is the same kind of view of technology.
Well, Gary, it's really a fascinating study. We're just almost out of time, so we've got to tell you that he gets into this house, this vehicle, like a UFO, a smaller one that takes him up to a larger house, which sounds like, you know, like a mothership. I don't know if he goes through a dimensional door into heaven, or if he goes to the New Jerusalem, or if he goes to a mothership. Nevertheless, when he gets inside, he sees the assembly room and the throne of God. And Gary, the place is so big that Enoch says that before the throne of God, there is a huge chamber full of 10,000 times 10,000 angels. That's 100 million in my calculation. That's a lot.
Well, JR, it's sad that at this moment that we're running out of time, but quickly let me say that we're getting to a place now where we're going to be talking about high technology in the book of Enoch, superconductivity, high voltage electrical fields. We're talking about flying without the use of engines or wings. We're talking about things that Enoch had to experience in order to be able to describe to us.
Yes, and we'll get into the technology of it on our next study in the book of Enoch. If you don't know Christ as your Savior, trust Him today. Get ready for that trip. I'm J.R. Church, Gary Stearman. Until next time, keep looking up.